Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of technological evolution, with experts predicting that it could add trillions of dollars to our GDP, but it could have a negative impact on our workforce and national security. So how do we regulate it without stifling innovation? Our podcast has featured various perspectives, industry leaders to government officials to advocacy groups. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create practical legislation. I'm very excited to have Professor Sarah Kreps with us today. She's the John Wetherell Professor in the Department of Government, Adjunct Professor of Law, and the Director of the Tech Policy Institute in the Cornell Brooks School of Public Policy. I invited her on this show as it is very important to get different perspectives towards framing AI legislation. And we need to get a perspective from an expert in international politics, technology, and national security. Welcome, Sarah. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's great to be here.
Great. So, Sarah, we talk about how the impact of AI on national security. So let's dive deep into it. In your view, how do the advancements in AI technology impact national security concerns? And what key considerations should legislators bear in mind when they're framing AI-related legislation?
So it's a good first question, and it's a really big one. So hopefully we'll put some ideas on the table to get our conversation going. One of the challenges with AI is that it's a huge term that covers so many different applications. So artificial intelligence is generally what a lot of people think of it now is as generative AI. So these tools like ChatGPT, but it's a lot bigger than that. We have AI in many other different domains. And so a challenge for legislators is, when we think about guardrails, is what kinds of AI are we worried about? And I think in a national security context, there are a few different categories of the ways in which AI could affect national security. And none of those are necessarily new per se. It's that AI will accelerate and intensify the types of national security risks we've faced in the past, but then just amplify them. So I'll give a couple of examples. So in fact, I wrote a paper for the Brookings Institution called Democratizing Harm, Artificial Intelligence in the Hands of Non-State Actors. And I organized around around three different AI-empowered threats. So drones, cyber attacks, and online information operations. So all of those have been threats already. We saw recently, just a few days ago, that U.S. troops were targeted by drones. Those were not AI drones. We know that cyber attacks are something that states and non-states, individuals have been dealing with for a long time. And online information operations are thousands of years old. What AI does in each of these cases is it just makes them all the more efficient. And we could talk about any of those. The one that I think gets a lot of attention now is the possibility of very targeted online information operations. So if we think about the 2016 election, where the Russian Internet Research Agency had used big data that they had acquired from Cambridge Analytica, they run some statistical analyses to figure out that certain demographics between the ages of 18 and 30 tend to click on or spend a lot of time on these types of sites. So what you can do with that information is then micro target. So to try to understand the psychology of those individuals based on what they're doing online. And so AI can do that, but then amplify that even more. So it can become even more targeted. So that's something that, in fact, the CEO of OpenAI has said that he worries that AI will be capable of superhuman persuasion well before it's superhuman at the general intelligence level. And so I think that's one of the concerns that maybe just to start with in terms of national security context, we've seen already that there's a real interest in foreign actors engaging in online misinformation. And now we have tools that can make them even better at that.
So, Sarah, you pointed out three areas, as you said, drones, the cyber, and the misinformation. And they were active even before AI. And you said AI obviously makes them a lot more efficient and maybe much easier for non-state actors or other actors to do it. What role, and you pointed out that recently we had some American troops that were killed because of a drone attack, but that was probably not an AI drone attack. And, the AI has some serious implications in drone attacks, etc. But we also have an election coming up in this country where the big fear is what can happen through the use of AI, whether it's deep fakes, etc. And it's not just in this country. There's close to maybe 60 countries that are going in across the world for elections over a period of time. And there's a big concern about some of these things. Is there a role of legislators, regulators, in terms of whether it's people who talked about there are some bills pending for deep fakes, there are some pending for some of these things. What do you think is the role of regulators or legislators in this?
Yeah, so I think that's an important question. And in fact, already last summer, I was talking to members on the Hill that are involved in these electoral rules, trying to figure out what should be done. And so I think the right questions are being asked, which are, how can AI be manipulating elections? The problem is that there are a couple of problems with this dilemma, which is, one is that there is often a tendency for policymakers to be fighting the last war. So we know what happened in 2016, 2020, and in a lot of ways, that's the best guide we have to this year. But that's not the only, that's probably not their playbook. By there, I mean some malicious actors. And so I think there can be a tendency to just kind of be stuck in the previous iteration of a technology and the associated threat. And so what I think is happening, or what I see happening, and I'm writing a book right now on these kinds of questions, which is, you have new technologies, they pose threats. How does the ecosystem respond and rein in and provide guardrails? And what I think often happens is the legislation cannot move as quickly as it needs to address these potential problems. And so what I'm seeing in the generative AI space when it comes to these concerns is that a lot of the big platforms, and I'm most familiar with ChatGPT and OpenAI, they have undertaken a number of steps to try to address this concern. So they released a set of policies on electoral fidelity in ways that are trying to address this. What's interesting when you talk to the AI firms is that no one wants to be what Facebook was in the 2016 election, which was to be caught blindsided. And I think there's a real sense that these generative AI platforms recognize and have learned from those lessons, and they're taking steps to avoid being in an analogous situation. So ChatGPT, there are a number of different guardrails that they've imposed to try to, or to make it impossible to do things like generate misinformation about the ability or inability to vote or the location of voting, anything that could manipulate citizens' access to information about the election. So what always happens is that adversarial actors are trying to jailbreak these models and try to get the models to be able to generate the unfaithful information. But I do think that in that sort of regulatory void, these platforms have learned that once they lose the trust of the society that's using the tools, it's really hard to earn that back. And so they're trying to take these prophylactic measures to avoid being in that situation. And I think there is evidence that that actually is being done.
So just to follow up on that point, you talked about OpenAI, but and now there's text to video, there's text to image. I mean, all of those tools are way easily done. And there's also open source tools out there. So in the executive order that President Biden had, he talked a lot about this watermarking technology. What are your thoughts on watermarking? Do you think that's a solution for some of these challenges that we are facing?
Yeah, I do think that technology has come a long way and is a step in the right direction. But your comment as well about these text to video, text to images, I mean, it's a huge problem. And again, it's hard to know from the perspective of a legislator what to do about that. But Google, for example, this was probably last summer as well, summer 2023, announced that YouTube would not allow deep fake campaign ads. And so these platforms then have to find some way to identify when something is a video, a deep fake. But that's another measure that is being implemented to try to get around these concerns about manipulated and inauthentic content online. And I think, the challenge in a lot of ways is not even at the federal level, because I think we've seen a number of very prominent international political actors where they were the subject of deep fakes. And the reason is that they have so many images online. And of course, the more images you have, the easier it is to make a high resolution or a credible deep fake. One of the big concerns, and I think this gets less attention than it should, is at the state and local level. We all are sort of familiar with what Joe Biden looks like or Donald Trump looks like, and I think could pretty quickly identify, oh, that's an inauthentic image. But what about the guy who's running for mayor and you don't really know who that is, or the person who's running for Senate? Maybe you've seen them on TV once, and now suddenly you see this deep fake image. You don't know kind of the way his eyebrows move when he would be normally talking. And so I think that those state and local level impacts might actually be more serious and harder to get around.
Well, that's a great point because we focused so heavily on the federal side, and uh, you know we have state and local elections happening all the time, and they could have a serious impact because states also run by governors and their own legislature. But there are 30 states that have some kind of an AI legislation going on. Now, the obvious issue is, will the federal preempt, et cetera? So you get into this whole federal state conundrum. Sarah, the one question that comes is, how can AI legislation strike a balance between, fostering innovation, especially in the national security sector, and then also prevent misuse? Because we live in a dangerous world. Everybody doesn't play by our rules. Now, obviously, our companies, we want them to innovate, but how can we have a legislation that can strike a balance in innovation. And you also raised a point about how can legislation keep up? Because look at what's happened even in AI. Let's just take ChatGPT. ChatGPT came out. We've got 3.5, 4.0. Now you have multimodal. You have agents. Now Sam Altman's talking about the coming of AGI very soon. So obviously, so there are two aspects. We want to keep innovation going, and obviously, we want to have legislation that keeps pace with the dynamic nature of AI. What do you think is the answer to this?
It is a real challenge. And even now, and if we want to just think just about generative AI, there's a lot of ridicule and derision about continuing to rely on the 1976 Copyright Act for IP. And here we are kind of back with the 1976 Copyright Act as guiding whether the training data that goes into ChatGPT is considered fair use or not, if it comes from the New York Times. So that's one strategy, is for there to almost like, if we think about the US Constitution and it's hundreds of years old, and you think, well, the country looked a lot different, in the 18th century than it does today. How do we need a new constitution? And one interpretation would suggest that what countries do is they evolve their interpretation of something that is more dated. And I think that's what we're seeing happen now, is trying to interpret an older set of laws that might seem like they're outdated, but now just kind of with a different eye. So I think we see that happening in the generative AI context. I think one of the things for legislators that they're still trying to really wrap their head around, what are the primary concerns, the primary risks they're trying to address? What are the market failures that they're looking at? And one of the ones that you hear most often is that this is leading to the loss of jobs in traditional industries, like we're seeing right now with journalism. And it's not that AI is the reason why some of these newspaper staffs are laying off 20% of their employees, but that's a part of it. But even if there's an agreement that AI is supplanting some traditional journalism work, what is is that something that is a part of a dynamic economy, or is that something that should be addressed? And I think there's really not a consensus on that. And I think adding to that is not only is it hard to for members of Congress to wrap their head around what is the core issue that they're concerned about, but as you had mentioned, there's this broader geostrategic picture that they're worried about, which is that the top seven companies in the US by market cap are tech companies. All of them have gone and done a deep dive into AI. So any legislation that is going to in any way impede further development on AI is going to have this second order effect of impeding these industries that are at the engine of the US economic competition with China. So we haven't talked about, and this is kind of, at the periphery, but the US has now export controls that have limited the ability of the US semiconductor firms like NVIDIA to sell to China. So AI is, and then of course NVIDIA makes the GPUs that power AI and generative AI in particular, and so that is an indication of how core AI is to this broader geostrategic competition. So it's a real dilemma. So how does the U.S. protect itself in terms of national security risks? And then how does it do it in a way that isn't going to kneecap it in terms of this broader geostrategic competition with China?
So you brought up two very important points. One is, you talked about the Magnificent Seven, so to speak, driving the economy and not doing anything that would hurt them. But so one question for you on that is, isn't there a danger of monopoly? We kind of like in social media. Yes, we don't want to obviously disrupt anything towards that. And so that's one question. Then the second thing is, you talked about this AI nationalism where, countries are, taking a stake in it. We put some export limitations on towards China. There are other countries who, are doing what can be done. So is there potential for some global collaboration in terms of legislation as far as AI is concerned? So two questions. One is, yes, we want to protect the seven companies who have gone all deep in there. And to train these models, it's very expensive. A startup can hardly do it unless you're Anthropic and you raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So are we looking at a danger of monopoly there?
I do think that there's a concern that because this is so resource intensive, the ability, the capacity to generate these models is increasingly in the hands of a few companies. And I think that's why you saw over the last couple of years these partnerships between big tech and these, quote, generative AI startups like OpenAI and Anthropic, because it's a real win-win. Microsoft could see the writing on the wall and a couple of years ago invested $1 billion in OpenAI, which they followed up with another $12 billion. So Microsoft gets the benefit of this scrappy AI startup, and OpenAI gets the benefit of Microsoft's resources. And those resources are not just financial. It's things like navigating complex bureaucracy. So another concern that is related to this about legislation that I think we've seen in other domains is that if you create regulation in the form of laws, and you've seen this actually with GDPR in Europe, is that it hurts most the small startups that don't have the resources to navigate and comply with these regulations. So Facebook, which is now soaring to new heights, I think was in some ways the intended target, one of the big intended targets of things of GDPR in Europe. And it's doing fine. But what it does is it hinders these smaller startups that lack the resources, again, not just to do to generate the models, but then even just navigate this complicated wicket of regulation. So it's just another kind of unintended consequence to consider about legislation, is that who is it really actually going to harm? It's probably not going to harm the partnership between OpenAI and Microsoft, and it's probably not going to harm Anthropic that is working with Amazon and Google. It's going to hurt the smaller startups, and you're going to end up in this kind of monopoly situation that would raise a whole other set of concerns.
So the other question was this, the AI nationalism. How does the international landscape influence national approaches, to AI legislation? I mean, do you think there's a potential for some kind of, a global consensus? The EU AI Act is now, in the books. It has to work its way. In 2 years, it'll be law. What do you think in terms of some global cooperation, especially in terms of security?
Yeah, I think this is a bigger challenge than most people would realize, or maybe most people realize this would be a challenge. But I was talking to some people about this issue recently, and let's say the UK efforts and their AI Institute and the US AI Institute and any global efforts, and none of them are coordinated. And so I've actually written on AI global governance issues, and my input to this paper was that this is really hard to coordinate because there's so many different equities involved. And so where we arrived was that it's important to try to outline a set of standards, almost a new set of norms on what are the appropriate uses or misuses. But it's really hard to get much beyond that. And there are a few reasons for that I think might be a bit less obvious. So right now, all of the biggest generative AI platforms are American. And so there's a complicated and national security IP, proprietary IP kind of issue behind sharing the data, the training data and the weights behind these models. And it would be hard for for any kind of global governance or national governance like the UK to develop something on AI safety, given that the US won't share these models. And when I asked this question about what do you mean that the US won't share these models, these aren't US government models, but the platforms haven't gotten to a point where they're willing to share because they have their own corporate reasons, but there is a pretty clear sense on the side of the US government that they would not allow that anyway because of the national security risk. And I said, well, what about sharing with the UK? We share all kinds of top secret, Five Eyes kind of intelligence with them. And the response I got was, well, so it's the UK now, and then France is going to want it. And then where do you draw this line on this slippery slope? So I think that's an impediment, just these models now are basically worth, billions of dollars. And it's now this close integration between the economic aspects for these platforms and the national security value to the United States that I think is really an impediment to broad or deep global governance strategies.
So I come back to the whole open sourcing question, Sarah. Facebook's got Llama 2. They're going to be open sourcing Llama 3. Mark Zuckerberg has said he might even open source AGI. Mistral is open sourcing their weights and everything in Europe. So where do you think? Do you think open source is good or closed source? Where do you come out on this debate, especially from the view of national security?
Yeah, I know. This is a good question. And I think people in policy would love to outlaw open source beyond a certain point. Yes, Zuckerberg is talking about building open source AGI. Of course, OpenAI is no longer open source. And I think the challenge again is that in a way that the financial stakes now are so high. And there are not a lot of incentives to first invest the billions of dollars you need to run these models and then have it be open source. So I think there's a competing set of incentives here that creates challenges. So I think it's a good question, though.
So Sarah, just turning to ethics, are there special ethical considerations that are unique to AI applications in the national security domain? And do you think legislation can address those ethical questions?
Yeah, the ethical questions are, as ethics always are, a lot of questions in the gray. So I started working, I've been working this space now since 2018. So, a few years. And one of the platforms I was looking to develop was a kind of a ChatGPT, but to link legislators with their constituents, because legislators are really busy. They need to listen and understand their constituents, but the constituents want to be heard. And so this tool was going to both process and analyze their inbound. So what are the concerns on a given week that a legislator is receiving, but then also provide a way for staffers to fairly quickly but meaningfully respond to members of Congress. So I had been working on this for a few years, and one of the things that we were hearing a lot about was, well, people are not going to love the idea that some AI is helping the staffer reply to their emails. And it's funny because now, after ChatGPT, I think the norms and the sense of where AI would percolate changed a lot. I don't know where ethics, I think the question, just getting back to this particular app, is pretty unclear. How do we know what is the appropriate set of ethics around using an AI to help busy staffers respond to constituents? Not really clear. Some people had the view a year ago that might not be appropriate, but I think it's just the ubiquity of AI now. It has changed sort of that sense of where might be appropriate or inappropriate to use AI or not. So I think, again, it comes back to this question of how do we even think about what the appropriate ethical framework is for AI? I think one of the ones that is most clear-cut to me and is the use of AI in targeting on a battlefield. So we talked about drones early in the conversation, and countries are increasingly using drones on the battlefield. So what happens now? And one of the challenges is, of course, ensuring, in terms of compliance with international law, that we can identify and discern the difference between a combatant and a civilian on the battlefield, and target the combatant and spare the civilian. So some people have made the argument that AI can process all this data and then give these probabilistic assessments that this particular this figure on the battlefield is 95% likely to be a combatant. And can you automate that? And my view would be no, that you need to keep that can help guide a decision, but it shouldn't replace the human element in the decision making. So that I think is an area where it's a bit more clear cut in terms of those ethical frameworks, and I think has emerged in recent years as a pretty clear and firm consensus that a human needs to remain in the loop on the use of autonomy on the battlefield. So I think to the extent that we can articulate those ethical questions and lead to consensus, some kind of consensus, that's the right step. But that's taken probably a decade in this autonomy space on the battlefield. So I don't think we yet have kind of clear ethical guideposts. And as we've talked about in this conversation, even if you can get the big platforms, let's say like OpenAI, to restrict, and they have become very restrictive in what you can search for, trying to jailbreak their ethical boundaries. There's so many other models out there that they're less capacious, but that have not taken these ethical considerations into mind. So I think that this is such a quickly evolving space that hopefully conversations like ours can be moving the needle a little bit, or at least framing the discourse in terms of what are the right ethical questions to be asking.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Sarah, in terms of transparency and accountability, how do you think AI legislation can ensure responsible practices in national security without compromising classified information? Because that's always the tug and pull. And you kind of alluded to some of that, but uh, is there a way to kind of do that?
So right on the kind of need for secrecy. Yeah, I think that's emerging as a kind of a pretty thorny issue, which is how can there be a kind of international or cross-national or meaningful set of constraints, and without compromising secrecy. And what does secrecy even mean here? It surprised me a little bit to think about corporate assets and IP as a national security issue. It's not to say that I was surprised, but I hadn't quite thought about it in this generative AI context. But it makes a lot of sense. And these platforms that have committed billions of dollars investing in these models and the model weights are essentially now, national security assets. So thinking about those issues of secrecy is a relevant consideration, but another issue that we haven't talked about that is relevant here is, what the AI platforms will say is that understanding these models is very complicated. And so I think, legislators are still trying to study up on how to even think about this technology in a way, in an informed way, because it's not totally straightforward and it's changing a lot. So I think that's another consideration, is just sort of continuing to work with industry to understand what those developments are, because if they're not staying on top of what's happening in industry, they can't be thinking about how to construct meaningful legislation themselves.
So, Sarah, how receptive do you think our national security agencies would be to regulatory frameworks around AI? Are they going to be responsive to that?
I think a lot of ideas have been kicked around, but I think they still seem to be in the almost fact-finding stage of the operation, trying to figure out, again, frame the problem and consider what sorts of plausible solutions there might be. And frankly, I saw a lot more movement on this in the 6 months after the release of ChatGPT than I have more recently. And I wonder whether, a few things are now emerging. One is that there was a lot of flurry around the release of ChatGPT that seems to be kind of settling down a bit, but also we're entering an election year. And it's not entirely clear to me, and probably to members of Congress, how salient an issue this is to the public. So how much political capital to expend on trying to solve a problem that I don't think is surfacing necessarily when they go to a town hall meeting in their state. So again, my read is kind of a taking of the pulse, is that there was a lot more momentum behind taking action on AI a year ago than there is now. And I think, just to kind of summarize what I was just saying, I think part of that is settling into what seems to be a more stable equilibrium in terms of AI development, but also just entering an election year where there's so many competing needs politically that these members of Congress have, that I think it's really easy to take their eye off this AI ball.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things keep changing. We have wars, we have economy, soft landing, etc. As you know, attention span is very limited. Sarah, in terms of, we talk about privacy and civil liberties. How can AI legislation impact intelligence gathering and analysis, especially in terms of privacy and civil liberties? Do you think AI is going to impact that?
So do you mean on the domestic
Yeah, I'm
front?
talking about in terms of domestic front.
And so the question is about whether AI legislation is going to try to address these concerns. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I saw in the executive order from the last part of 2023. That seemed quite aspirational to me in the sense that the US Congress has been talking about comprehensive privacy legislation. That came up about just under a year ago when the TikTok CEO was on Capitol Hill, and both members of Congress, both sides of the aisle said, yes, we need comprehensive privacy legislation. And it hasn't manifested because we have this partisan gridlock that the two parties might agree that it's important, but they can't figure out how to do it in a way that's palatable ideologically. So I'm not optimistic that they would be moving in that direction. And I thought that when the EO came out, that this is just pie in the sky thinking that's pretty unlikely in reality.
Well, Sarah, to the end of our discussion, our podcast is watched on the Hill quite a bit by members of Congress, their staffers, etc. Do you have any message in terms of national security or some of the papers? You've written some excellent papers. Concluding message for some of our listeners?
Yeah, I do. And I'm really heartened to hear you ending with that, because I was just thinking that I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. I guess it's more that I'm very sympathetic to everything that members of Congress are trying to juggle. And on top of that, these are complicated technologies, and trying to figure out, first, what is the risk? Second is, do we have existing legislation? What happens if we don't have the right legislation in place? Or what other things can we do? And I actually think in a lot of ways, Congress has been doing the right thing with respect to these new technologies. There have been so many efforts to bring in experts, to work with industry. So for this book, I've been interviewing a lot of members from industry, and it's really clear that these partnerships, these public-private partnerships, are more than just like buzz phrases that get thrown out. There's so much more cooperation with across the public sector and private. And for example, when I was in government many years ago, where it felt at times more adversarial. And I think now there's this understanding that both the public sector and the private sector can win if they're working in concert with each other. So I think more continuing down that collaborative road is really important, so that the U.S. government can learn from and try to shape what's happening in industry. And I think actually a lot can happen by bringing in industry or NGOs onto the Hill, both in terms of, and I think this is an underappreciated aspect of what Congress does, is that bringing in experts, witnesses, industry onto the Hill for these public questionings is really both informative to Congress, informative to the public, but also puts these members of industry on notice that they're being watched. And so they need to do the right thing. And so I think I would urge Congress to continue to be curious about these technologies, because I think that's a first and important step toward keeping those technologies accountable.
So Sarah, just to follow up, what you're saying is an awareness in Congress itself about these technologies is very important. Information, knowledge, etc. And that's something that we are doing through this and many other forums, and folks like you are very important. but you also talked about the public-private partnerships coming in. But it should be a wide range of sessions coming in. There should not just be industry, there should be people coming in from manufacturing sector, healthcare, and others. Shouldn't there be a broader discourse of people coming in to get some kind of legislation done?
I absolutely agree. And when I looked at the list for the AI summit, I think it was the Senator Schumer summit, it almost looked like it was the kind of industry version of the Grammys. And I think those actors, Bill Gates and Sam Altman, great to have them in the room. I just think you're going to get a very skewed picture by only talking to Taylor Swift and Beyonce. Like, you need to talk, to continue this metaphor, you need to talk to the startups, the 10-person startups. You need to talk to NGOs. So that does seem until now like it's been a bit of a blind spot in terms of some of the more prominent AI events on the Hill. So I think some more, a broader array of stakeholders than I've seen does seem like a warranted recommendation.
Well, I think we are in complete agreement because that's what we are trying to do. We bring in different stakeholders, whether it's community colleges, manufacturing companies, healthcare, rural healthcare, because they're all going to be impacted by what we do with AI. And for the briefings that we are holding on the Hill, we are also bringing different stakeholders. But Sarah, thanks so much. I could have, we run out of time, but there are so many other things we want to ask you with your vast knowledge, but maybe we'll have you again for part 2 or part 3. So thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Regulating AI Innovate Responsibly podcast. You'll find links in the show notes to any resources mentioned on the show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you'll never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.